Over the past few years, I found myself gravitating away from modern game releases, becoming more and more picky about what I play, and definitely about what I stick with right until the credits roll. I bounced off so many games in 2024. But that doesn't mean I didn't finish a lot of games. I've been amassing a ridiculous backlog since the 90s, and so time not spent on modern games is time spent on classics. Here's a rundown of the games I finished in 2024.
The city's a blank canvas, begging for us to paint it with our hopes and dreams. I want to show the hidden side of girls, their impulses, their urges.
Silent Hill is one of those series for which I have massive respect, but when I think back, I don't believe I've ever actually finished a single Silent Hill game. The short message hit at just the right time. I was still playing through Alan Wake 2 and was in the mood for more horror. Why not jump into a free game that was reportedly only a couple of hours long? From a gameplay standpoint, the short message is just okay. It's mainly a walking simulator, which is fine. The atmosphere is great, so the walking simulator bits really deliver, but the game features 3 or 4 chase sequences as well, and they're just terrible. Well, they don't start terrible, since the first one is pretty straightforward, but eventually these chases take place within mazes. In fact, the entire end sequence is a big scavenger hunt through a repeating maze that can just grind you down. Hero Anita has no way of defending herself, and so a single wrong turn can end the lengthy scene, requiring you to start the entire section all over again. And even though the maze does feature a bit of visual variety, you're running through so fast most of the time that it's just way too easy to get turned around. But I don't regret playing through the short message. It deals with some very difficult themes and feels quite modern, tackling everything from child abuse to self-abuse to teen suicide to the changing face of bullying in an always connected world and the mental toll the COVID-19 pandemic had on young adults. Speaking as the father of a tween and 2 teenagers, a lot of the themes in the game actually played on some of my deepest fears, and were at the same time fascinating and difficult to experience.
What's a man gotta do to get that kind of attention from you?
It's hard to say exactly, but you seem to be doing fine.
Well, great. Though truth is, it ain't me that wants you.
Oh?
No, Miss Jacqueline Natla does, from Natla Technologies. You know, creator of all things bright and beautiful.
Seal it, Larson.
Ma'am.
Feast your eyes on this, Laura. How does that make your wallet rumble?
I'm sorry. I only play for sport.
Then you'll like a big park. Peru, vast mountain ranges to cover, sheer walls of ice, rocky crags, savage winds, and there's this little trinket, an age-old artifact of mystical powers buried in the unfound tomb of Qualapec. That's my interest. You could leave tomorrow. Are you busy tomorrow?
The original Tomb Raider qualifies as one of my all-time favorite games. When it was released in 1996, it stood out for its excellent control and wonderfully designed levels. 3D action games were a pretty new thing at the time, and Core's successful attempt at what was basically a fully 3D Prince of Persia was one of the first ones I remember being really enjoyable. Plus, it scratched that Indiana Jones itch with a great globe-trotting adventure that started in Peru and finished in the lost city of Atlantis. I initially questioned whether it would be worth playing Tomb Raider Remastered. After all, Crystal Dynamics had already released a fantastic, modern interpretation of the original game with Tomb Raider Anniversary back in 2007. But with its budget price, it wasn't hard to justify at least giving Tomb Raider Remaster a try. And once I'd played the first couple of levels, I was hooked all over again. I played nothing else until I'd escaped Atlantis and rolled credits. Yeah, even with the new coat of paint, a lot of Tomb Raider looks old, because the grid-based levels are blocky. There's no way around that. But when you accept that, you'll find some wonderful puzzles here. Tomb Raider was at its best when it basically dropped Lara into a huge room and let the player sort out what to do next. Jumping and shimmying across platforms that reached dizzying heights while searching for treasure or discovering a new switch was just a joy. The philosophy behind the remaster is a great one. Basically, deliver the exact same game from 1996 with widescreen support, analog control, and some nice high-res textures. It doesn't really hold a candle to the anniversary game from 2007 visually, but this updated look is charming. And thankfully for those of us who prefer it, the original tank controls were included as well. The new look and increased draw distance did create some issues, though I think this is more of a nitpick than anything else. In the original Tomb Raider, the short draw distance and subsequent choice to leave the background in most levels black led to a real sense of isolation. The whole idea was that the low light made things murky, which let set pieces or enemies surprise you as they came into view. Likewise, it wasn't uncommon to look up and just be staring into a black void, increasing the suffocating sense of depth. You felt like you were so deep into an underground world that sunlight couldn't get to you. The developers of the remaster seemed to make a conscious decision to brighten everything up. There are loads of skylights scattered throughout a lot of the ceilings, completely changing the aesthetic. There's nothing particularly wrong with this, but it completely changes the atmosphere, and I have to wonder if this is somehow reversing a creative choice made by the original development crew at Core Design. Of course, if you long for that old school look, you can swap to the original graphics on the fly. Unfortunately, that also comes with a decreased frame rate, which can be really jarring. Overall, I was really happy with Tomb Raider 1 Remastered. I will say that the deeper I got into the game, the more graphical issues and bugs I found. Items floating out in space, set dressing that wasn't there, and so on. But none of it was enough to ruin my enjoyment. I'm so glad I decided to play through this again.
What happened? Alex? Your harp. You're playing so strange. Is something bothering you? You can tell me. Alex, please tell me what's wrong.
One of my all-time favorite RPGs. I began playing Lunar on my Twitch channel as a fundraising milestone for Extra Life. Lunar is a masterpiece, and what's more, it's a pretty light experience relative to other role-playing games from the early 90s. Challenging, but never overwhelming. I always enjoy giving this a playthrough, but even more so when I'm joined by viewers who have never played it at all, or have only experienced the beautiful story through one of the subsequent remakes. It had been a while since I picked up the original, and while the gameplay and systems have aged pretty well for the most part, the working design's translation really hasn't. I say that with full respect for what the company was doing for us in the early 90s. It was instrumental in introducing a whole generation of Western gamers to lesser-known niche games on platforms where they definitely didn't have a hope in hell of getting localized otherwise. So many of their games are extremely important to me, from this one to Dragon Force to the Gun Griffin and Sylphid sequels years later. But the very personality that made their games resonate with a teenage me make them seem too anachronistic now. I'm not saying that the humor was totally out of place at the time, because I think it's pretty clear to anyone who really looks that the original Lunar had its share of absurd moments, so it stands to reason there was always a comedy element. But wow, so many of the jokes and references in this translation were outdated about a week after the game hit the shelves. But this kind of makes it sound like I didn't enjoy playing through the game earlier this year, which isn't true. I absolutely loved it as much as I always have. Lunar's story is so well told and so sweet that I can't help but get drawn into it no matter how many times I play this game. I and my Twitch audience loved it so much that we decided to forego the next fundraising reward game and move straight on to Lunar Eternal Blue.
What the hell? From what I've gathered, you grew up nice and sheltered with mama's pretty stories and your own made-up fury. And mama gave me a magic clicker. Well, yes, I think it's true and fair to say.
After waiting over a decade for this sequel, I wasn't disappointed. Normally, when I rank my top 5 games from a given year for the Player One podcast, I limit the list to games I've actually finished. Alan Wake 2 was the exception. Even though I was probably only about halfway through the game by our awards show, I still awarded it one of my top 5 spots. I loved the way the original Alan Wake played, and Alan Wake 2 is just a more refined version of what I remember, with the added bonus of playing as both Wake and new protagonist Saga Anderson in a parallel storyline. It was a ballsy choice to allow players to basically hop back and forth between both storylines almost at will, but somehow it all works beautifully. Remedy's incredible ability to set the mood is on brilliant display in Alan Wake 2, from Saga being stalked by Taken in a gloomy forest while the blinking lights and cheering people of an amusement park are tantalizingly close, separated only by an impassable river, to the insane musical number where Alan has to navigate what can only be described as a music video where the in-world band Old Gods of Asgard and other characters sing his life. It's amazing. Remedy are truly the masters of mixing console-generated graphics with full-motion video. I won't pretend the story doesn't get a bit confusing, but that's the point. And somehow the ending pulls it all together in such a way that had me asking myself how I missed some of the obvious clues along the way. I couldn't wait for the 2 DLC episodes to drop.
When you're getting stressed out in front of the machine and you're indoors all day, and it's so nice just to be able to like go out and take a stroll in the field. You can't really be stressed out around sheep.
Before I checked out this interactive documentary, I'd have been hard-pressed to name a Jeff Minter game outside of Tempest 2000. But the Gold Master series from Digital Eclipse has been so brilliant thus far that I don't even feel like I need to be at all interested in the subject matter of each new release in order to buy in on day one. And yes, I'm counting Atari 50 alongside Karateka here. The Jeff Minter story didn't disappoint. Minter's story is interesting for so many reasons. His fierce dedication to staying true to his vision throughout his career is inspiring, and really shows through in this incredible documentary. From being a pivotal part of the European bedroom coder scene to remaining an indie dev decades later, it's all so fascinating. Even though I wouldn't say I hold his library of games in any high regard, seeing their evolution and all the making of material that went along with it was so fulfilling. Digital Eclipse is really onto something here. I can't wait for more of the Gold Master series. Ever since the Final Fantasy Pixel remasters were released, I've been intending to play through all of them. Sadly, that seems to have stalled out with Final Fantasy III. But anyway. Final Fantasy II has always been the black sheep of the family, at least in my opinion. It's just a weird game. But I've always respected the hell out of Squaresoft for trying something so off the wall with their first Final Fantasy sequel. Like the second game in so many big franchises that started on the NES, Super Mario Bros., Castlevania, The Legend of Zelda, Final Fantasy II rewrites much of what made its predecessors so beloved. The Pixel remaster of Final Fantasy II features the same gorgeous visual upgrades as the previous game, along with a breathtaking orchestrated score that ties the whole thing together. But more importantly, it offers similar quality of life upgrades that makes the game so much more playable than the original it's based on. Final Fantasy II does not feature a traditional RPG level-up mechanic, but rather increases character proficiencies based on their actions. Take a lot of damage and that character's hit points will increase. Cast a lot of a single spell and it will level up. Stick with a particular type of weapon and it becomes super effective. On paper it sounds great, but in practice it led to a game that was way too difficult and fiddly for its own good. And that was always a shame, because beneath the unique player progression sits what can only be considered a prototype for Square's future RPG epics. This is a very character-driven narrative, with lots of drama and big set-piece moments, along with a revolving door of party members. When you get free of the mechanics, it's easy to see the seeds of future classics like Final Fantasy IV or Chrono Trigger here. And that's what the various gameplay options in the Pixel remaster let you do. And I'm so glad I got to experience Final Fantasy II in such a leisurely way. one point in the last year, someone requested that I play Strider 2 on my Twitch channel. Back when it was released for the PlayStation, Capcom packed in an extra disc containing the original arcade version of Strider from 1989, so I figured, why not give this one a go as well? Most of my experience with Strider up until this PlayStation release was the fantastic Genesis port of the game from Sega, so much so that the arcade game actually feels a bit off to me. But it's still great. I've always loved how Strider feels like a very small story in a very well-established universe. Something that, at the time, I wanted to know more about. The gameplay is delightfully varied, constantly putting protagonist Hiryu into interesting situations. From spinning around a gravity generator to fighting a giant ape to riding atop dinosaurs in the jungle. You see so much during this relatively short game, and it all looks great, especially by 1989 standards. Plus, the acrobatic Hiryu is a pleasure to control, able to grab onto almost any surface and swing his iconic Cypher sword in such a quick arc that all you ever really see is the motion blur as the blade slices through his enemies. What a classic. Strider 2 is an interesting 2.5D take on the original format, featuring loads of generally really short levels and action that feels more frenetic than the first game. It's got a really great look, combining some very nice pixel art with a decent 3D world that allowed the game designers to realize their vision a bit more convincingly than by simply using flat 2D backgrounds. Mainly because the ability to pan and tilt the camera at key moments in each level makes the world feel much larger and lived in, way more epic. That being said, I don't hold Strider 2 in the same regard as the original game. Perhaps it's because side-scrolling action games had just come so far in the 10 years following the first Strider's release, and at that point we were totally spoiled for choice. Strider 2 isn't a bad game in the least, but its standout moments haven't really stuck with me the way things like the airship or the iconic run down a snowy slope from the first game did. My strongest memory of Strider 2 is actually a bit of controversy surrounding our review of the game in Electronic Gaming Monthly. Mark McDonald, Chris Johnston, and myself gave the game a pretty average score due to the unlimited continues. Eric Malonis, who was then the editor-in-chief of GameFan magazine, took that very personally for some reason, and spent his entire editorial a month or so later calling us out over it. The rant was pretty impressive, if a bit hard to follow. GameFan was in its dying days at that point, and Eric had pretty much focused his attention on calling out everyone who he'd decided wasn't hardcore enough. I never met the guy in person, and honestly, never really wanted to.
Let's see some sexy moves now.
In 2024, I finally took the plunge and bought a PSIO, allowing me to play disc images via the I/O port on an original model PlayStation. Bust a Groove is just something I decided to use as a test to make sure the setup was working. I ended up playing until I beat it, which admittedly doesn't take that long. But this game is just so good I didn't want to put it down after I'd started it. This NX rhythm game features some of the most likable characters and one of the all-time great soundtracks out there. It's so simple to play. For each bar of a song, you have to complete a series of button presses, ending with a specific press precisely on the fourth beat. Throw in some rudimentary fighting moves and blocks, and you're in for a good time. Visually, the game still looks great. Some of these PS1 games have aged so well. Seriously, one of the best looking games on the system, thanks in no small part to the wonderful art direction. I have to say I think I like Bust a Groove even more than Parappa the Rapper. Either way, they both represent the freedom the PlayStation's insane popularity afforded US publishers. They could take a chance on some of the more niche, weird games coming out of Japan with relatively little consequence. The system had hit critical mass, so even something that performed relatively poorly could likely cover its costs and even turn a small profit. Eyes is one of those games that's been in my collection for decades. Literally for decades. And I never really took a run at completing it. I'm not sure why I even own it, though I'm guessing it was a cheap purchase during the halcyon days when you could run into a Funko Land and leave with a stack of NES cartridges for the money you had in your wallet. Back then, I was just grabbing anything on the shelf that looked remotely interesting. I remembered 8 Eyes being covered in the video game magazines back in the day and looking like a Simon's Quest clone. Simon's Quest was one of my favorite games, so why not? But the visuals are where the similarities end. 8 Eyes is actually split into multiple levels, or houses, that are self-contained in every way. Items in your inventory don't carry over from level to level, so it's actually kind of jarring. What's more jarring is that the boss of each level can only be affected by a very specific sword, which means that there is a prescribed play order, even though it has to be discovered via just playing the game. That's right, you have to get to the boss of each level before you find out if you actually made the right choice. It's bizarre. 8 Eyes' big selling point back in the day was it's actually a simultaneous multiplayer game. Main character Orin keeps his falcon, Tetris, with him at all times. In a single-player game, you can command Tetris to fly, attack, and return at will. In fact, you have to use him to throw some switches in each level, and there are certain enemies that can only be defeated by the bird. A friend can grab controller 2 and control Tetris independently. It's an interesting play mechanic, both in single-player and multiplayer, and is just unique enough that 8 Eyes ends up feeling a bit more creative than a simple "we have Castlevania 2 at home" situation. That being said, it's not a great game. The bosses in particular all have similar attack patterns, which are really easy to exploit once you figure out how to fight the very first one. After that, the real challenge lies in finding the right items in each level and learning the proper order in which to tackle them. Games based on the 1989 Burton Batman film are a perfect example of what I loved about video games in the 90s. Sunsoft produced Batman games across 4 different consoles, and they were 4 completely different games. What's more, they were all good games. Batman on the Game Boy gets forgotten, but it's a load of fun. Yeah, Batman has a gun in this game, and of course that doesn't really jive with Batman's history, but whatever, this is a video game. I swear I finished Batman on Game Boy when I was a kid, but replaying it again in 2024, I have to say I can't imagine how I ever did it. This game is hard enough even when you're not playing on a tiny, blurry, reflective screen. Even though the game is extremely short, as most Game Boy games were back then, it took me 2 days of trying to get through the whole thing, and even then I needed to use save states on the final level. Batman on Game Boy really holds up, and it's entirely unique amongst the other Sunsoft Batman games. The NES game is still my fave, but the Game Boy game is just ahead of the Genesis as my second favorite of the 4. I'm a big Picross fan, but I've kind of fallen off the official releases over the past couple of years. I can't remember what possessed me to get Logiart Grimoire. Here you have something like 300 puzzles, all with the same sort of wonderful user interface from the Picross series. Logiart includes a fusion element, where you have to combine 2 or more previously solved puzzles in order to unlock a new challenge. It's okay the first few times you do it, but after a while it starts to wear on you. Luckily the game features a few different ways around this, narrowing your choices pretty quickly. I think there may even be a way to turn it off. While I kind of prefer my Picross games to feature classic game gimmickry like the Sega-themed title a few years back, I found I couldn't put down Logiart Grimoire until I had at least finished all the main puzzles. There's some really great stuff in here, and it's all wrapped up in a very attractive package. In In 1990, Capcom had freshly established itself as the premier purveyor of the finest Disney video games, what with DuckTales and Chip 'n Dale's Rescue Rangers on the NES. But Sega was working its own magic over on the Genesis, and it kicked off with Castle of Illusion. This game holds up so well even 35 years later. It's charming, it's fun, it has great music, and takes advantage of the power of the Genesis to create some of the most true-to-Disney visuals we'd seen up until that point. It was also a great example of how Sega was capable of releasing a platformer that could hold its own when compared to the best of the best on the NES. This was one of the earliest games I rented on the Genesis, and definitely helped convince me to buy the system. I still play it pretty much yearly. I've been on a journey through the Shining games on my Twitch channel over the past year. While I count Shining in the Darkness as one of my all-time favorites, and Shining Force barely left my Genesis when it was first released all those years ago, somehow I managed to skip over Shining Force 2 back in the day. Most likely I was playing Sega CD and Super Nintendo games. After all, Final Fantasy III came out on Super Nintendo around the same time. So I was really looking forward to playing through Shining Force 2, and I'm glad I rolled credits on this one, if only to say I finally experienced it. For the most part, I think the original Shining Force is a better game. It's much more focused and attractive. Shining Force 2 is filled with big overworld sections that serve almost no purpose, and ultimate weapons that require you to lug around lumps of mithril for the lion's share of the game, only to leave you at the mercy of a random number generator that rarely spits out the best weapon for any character. Visually, Shining Force 2 looks pretty great, but it suffers for the loss of character designer Yoshitaka Tamaki, who moved on before this sequel. Shining in the Darkness and Shining Force had wonderful looking characters, while Shining Force 2's cast just looks like a pale imitation to me. I wish I didn't sound so down on Shining Force 2, because it is a generally excellent game in the criminally underrated Genesis role-playing game library, but it doesn't quite live up to the Shining legacy in my opinion, at least not as it stood in 1993.
Mission 1, start!
I've been meaning to play through the Metal Slug games forever, and thanks to the awesome Analog Pocket and an August filled with flights all over Canada, I did just that. Well, the first 3 games anyway. The Metal Slug games have a reputation for being absolutely stunning, and for good reason. Even by today's standards, very little comes close to the sheer beauty and personality of these games. Each stage feels fresh, you're never too far away from a creative, screen-filling boss to fight, and the games are just overflowing with nice visual touches that show they were a labor of love for the developers. Enemies will scream as you approach and laugh when you die. The death animations are elaborate. The zombies can actually infect you, and you can keep playing even after becoming one of the shuffling undead yourself. Suddenly you're in a horizontal or vertical shooter. It's glorious. If there's any downside to the first 3 games, outside of the insane slowdown in some parts, it's that they're clearly balanced for arcade difficulty. I'm sure there are people in the world who can 1cc these things, but I will never be one of them. And while I normally don't have any issue with just continuing endlessly in arcade games, it definitely gets a bit silly in the later levels of the Metal Slug games. I felt like I was hitting the extra credit button more than the fire button sometimes. Still, I'm glad I at least took the time to experience the first few Metal Slug games. They're visual works of art, at the very least. I'm writing this in mid-October, so I can only guess how many games of the year lists Astro Bot ended up being on when this video gets released in early January, but I'm assuming the proper answer is most of them. Astro's Playroom was the surprise best part of the PlayStation 5 launch, and I'm sure I wasn't alone in pining for a proper follow-up. Astro Bot didn't disappoint. In a gaming landscape where big, open-world, 100-plus hour games seem to be the norm, Team Asobi proved once again that a group of tightly designed, linear levels that don't overstay their welcome is a supremely satisfying game experience. Like Astro's Playroom before it, Astro Bot's levels are overflowing with secrets to find, both puzzle pieces and other bots. And while Astro Bot isn't quite the trip down PlayStation memory lane its predecessor was, the history of the brand is constantly underneath the surface, with bots dressed in classic PlayStation character costumes, lots of hardware references, and entire levels paying homage to PlayStation landmark series like Uncharted, Loco Roco, and Horizon. But the game doesn't hinge on these and is filled with original levels that are great on their own. The first DLC pack for one of my favorite games of 2023, Wider World of Atari, expands upon the already incredible interactive documentary from Digital Eclipse with all new interviews and historical artifacts, as well as 19 more games. I absolutely love this formula that Digital Eclipse has settled on, so any more of it is always welcome. This update focused on the different divisions of Atari, coin-op and consumer, and detailed the unique challenges of working within both. I particularly liked seeing interviews with Evelyn Cito and her experience working in the art department, complete with glimpses of unused concept art for various Atari games and boxes. It was also a kick to get a look at just how long Atari was supporting its home consoles, including the 2600, after the NES had come out in the United States and changed the industry. Of the new games included, I'd have to say my favorite was Berserk, both the original arcade game and the excellent 2600 port. It struck me how much more I enjoyed it than the subsequent 5200 version. This left me jonesing for the eventual First Console War DLC in November. Nomada Studios' previous game, Grease, is one I discovered thanks to a member of my Twitch audience who pointed out that it seemed like something I would really get into. He was right. I loved Grease right off the bat. So much so that I was desperately looking forward to this follow-up. Unlike Grease, Neva balanced out environmental puzzle solving with ever-evolving combat. The story centers around Alba and her canine-like companion, Neva. After a heartbreaking opening scene where a fully grown dog-like creature is overcome by the darkness that is apparently attacking this entire world, you set out on your quest alongside a surviving pup. Neva isn't so much a helpful companion here as she is something you need to care for, like a puppy or a small child. She wanders away, she gets in trouble and needs to be saved. You get it. The gameplay in Neva is pretty satisfying overall. It's not going to win any awards or anything, but the simplistic combat and navigation flows very nicely and is balanced enough that neither ever gets boring. The developers took some risks with the level designs, leaving long stretches where nothing really happens to Alba as she navigates deep, dark caverns or wide fields featuring breathtaking horizons. It gives the game a chance to breathe, and the player a chance to really appreciate the stunning soundtrack. Seriously, I think this is my favorite new background music of the year. Neva follows a pretty linear progression through the 4 seasons, giving all 4 levels a unique and beautiful color palette. The darkness and the creatures born of it look like they belong in a Ghibli film, right up to the big baddie herself. As the seasons progress, Neva grows from a baby to an adolescent to an adult, similar to the one seen in the game's opening. As she grows, she transitions from a toddler that needs constant minding to a force all her own, reliable in navigation and combat. When I played Neva, I was in a pretty low place. Not only was I going through some personal issues, but I was watching one of my best friend's marriage come to an end and learning of another good friend's sudden passing. That week sucked. So when I found myself getting a bit emotional during the ending of Neva, I chalked it up to all these outside influences. However, in preparation for this video, I did a bit of research on the game. I normally try to avoid too much pre-release information on games I'm interested in playing, and I found that the development team, while it left the story intentionally vague, really drew on their collective experience of raising children from helpless infants all the way up to functioning adults, and now I think I understand why the game really resonated with me.
The dictionary definition of the word is an enthusiast, a fervent devotee, an abbreviation of fanatic. What comes across to an outsider as a dangerous obsession or even madness is something entirely different from the point of view of the fan herself. To be a fan is a joyous existence, one filled with the happiness that stems from knowing with utter clarity the purpose of your life. But what if that purpose could be more still? If you could be lifted out of the flock as your idol's chosen one, the only one who could decipher his secret messages. What lengths would you go to save the object of your obsession in Night Springs?
Remember back at the beginning of the video when I mentioned that I couldn't wait to play the DLC episodes of Alan Wake 2? Turns out I absolutely could wait to play the DLC episodes of Alan Wake 2, as I sat on Night Springs for the better part of the year before finally firing it up. But I'm so glad I did. As I'm sure fans of the game's universe probably guessed, the Night Springs DLC is related to the in-universe television show of the same name, sort of its version of the Twilight Zone, The Outer Limits. It features 3 different episodes that take place in and around Bright Falls, at least they use the same environments. Number One Fan is a hilariously written, deluded fantasy from the perspective of an obsessive Alan Wake fan who goes on a shooting spree to save her favorite author from his hitherto unknown evil twin. You're basically running through Bright Falls, shooting what feels like an endless wave of enemies while you chase this motorcycle-riding bad boy all the way to a final confrontation. I absolutely loved the writing in this episode, as the main character acts as the narrator and clearly the author of all the NPC dialogue, as it's overrun with ridiculous lines like, "I'll run the restaurant while you're away, but not as well as you do." It's really great. The second episode, North Star, features Jessie Faden from Control as she creeps around the haunted Coffee World amusement park. It's much more in line with Saga's experience at the park in the main game. Tension-filled with some jump scares and light stealth sections where failure results in an automatic game over. Not as memorable as the first episode, but I do appreciate how it changed up the gameplay and atmosphere so completely. The final episode, Timebreaker, is definitely the star of the show. Here you actually play as Sean Ashmore, the actor who played Jack Joyce in Quantum Break, as well as playing a sheriff in Alan Wake 2. Timebreaker expands on his hinted multi-dimensional existence in the main game as he hops from place to place and time to time in a multiverse-esque story that goes places you really don't expect, exploring not only different times and spaces within the game world, but within the delivery medium as well. At one point you're actually playing a text adventure. It's wild and it really works. I knew I was going to enjoy the Night Springs DLC even before I started it, but I wasn't really prepared for just how much I liked it.
After the success of the Atari VCS, Mattel as a toy company looked at this and said, maybe we should consider getting into this business.
I had very high hopes for the second DLC pack on Atari 50. What an interesting angle to take in a celebration of Atari and its games and hardware. While I think calling this the first console war is kind of overselling Intellivision's place in the market at the time, it does fit in that Mattel took on Atari directly in its advertising, much the same way Sega would take on Nintendo a decade later. But in all honesty, Intellivision was never in danger of dethroning the Atari 2600, and they say as much in the interviews included. From a documentary standpoint, I'm pretty happy with this DLC. Don Daglow and Jane Turgeon joined the established cast of interviewees on Atari 50 to bring their memories of Mattel Electronics and M Network to the fold, and that's all great. But overall, this DLC felt kind of anemic. It goes from some interesting video interviews and classic Intellivision versus Atari George Plimpton commercials to a long list of games. That wouldn't be such a bad thing, but rather than offering us the option to play actual Intellivision games, Atari 50 focuses solely on Intellivision games that were subsequently ported to the Atari 2600 and released under the M Network label. And I do get it. This is a celebration of Atari, after all. But I think a case could have easily been made for including the original Intellivision games for comparison's sake. After all, the up-to-the-minute story of Atari is that its current incarnation now owns the Intellivision brand. Anyway, I hate to complain about anything Digital Eclipse is doing to document and preserve game history, but the first console war DLC for Atari 50 just doesn't live up to the standard it's set with this product, or with the Gold Master series in general.
Hi everybody, I'm Alexei Pajitnov. 10 years ago, I invented a game called Tetris.
Speaking of the Gold Master series, Tetris Forever was definitely one of my most anticipated games of 2024. With the way Digital Eclipse has managed to handle subjects I was only a little bit interested in with Karateka and Llamasoft, I was ready to be blown away by their Tetris documentary. And I was, for the most part. From a traditional documentary perspective, this is one of the best I've seen for Tetris, which is really saying something since there's a lot of really great content out there already. This story has been told and retold so many times at this point, I was a bit worried that they wouldn't be able to make it feel fresh. But by focusing heavily on the relationship between Hank Rogers of Bulletproof Software and Tetris creator Alexei Pajitnov, it turns the whole thing into kind of a buddy film, and I'm totally here for it. Near the end of the experience, you get the two of them sitting together just chatting about their friendship, and you can really see the mutual admiration that still exists between them 35 years after their first meeting. It's downright heartwarming. I also want to call out the quality of the interviews this time around. Ever since 2020, we've been trained to accept Zoom call quality video on everything from documentaries to professional news broadcasts. And while I understand that was originally out of necessity, I feel like with so many other things, we've simply stayed that way in the wake of the pandemic in order to justify hiring fewer professional camera operators and news gatherers. That's why I was so pleased to see Area 5 handling production for the lion's share of the video in Tetris Forever. Their standards are extremely high and it really shines through here. Now for the negative bit. Speaking as someone who grew up playing consoles, when I think of Tetris, I think of three particular versions of Tetris. The Tengen version on the NES, the Nintendo version on the NES, and most importantly the Game Boy version. While all of these feature prominently in the Tetris Forever documentary, none of them are actually playable. In fact, there are a surprising amount of Tetris versions that are not playable here. The Atari arcade version, the Sega arcade or Mega Drive game, the various sequels that are mentioned such as Weltris and Faces, nor almost any of the later licensed versions. I get why this is the case. I know the team's hands were likely tied due to all manner of licensing issues here. But much like the first console war DLC for Atari 50, the end result kind of feels like it doesn't quite live up to the high standard Digital Eclipse has set with the Gold Master series so far. In the previous documentary experiences, if a game was even mentioned at all, it was nearly certain you'd get to try it out. With Tetris Forever, well, I hope you really like Bombliss. None of this kills the overall experience, and like I said, documentary side of Tetris Forever is a new high water mark for the Gold Master series. I was just left wanting a bit more.
Eat this, cookie face! Two down, one to go.
I've owned Popful Mail since it was first released, having been a big fan of the Sega CD and of Working Design's output on the system. And while I've played the opening section of this game many times, I always stall out pretty quickly due to the unforgiving difficulty. In 2024, I resolved to finally play all the way through the game, but this time I used the Unworked Designs patch, which kept the original English translation and voice work, but reset all of the difficulty-enhancing foolishness Working Designs was notorious for adding to their games. I didn't realize it until I looked this up, but the adjustments made to Popful Mail were crazy. Item prices were raised by an average of 360%, with one item in particular being 1,400% more expensive than it was in the original game. Likewise, damage numbers were pumped up by as much as 10 points, while enemy attack power was raised between 50 and 150%, some even higher. No wonder I could never stick with this game. Reverting to the original values of the Japanese game made Popful Mail extremely playable. I'm so glad I finally got to experience the entire thing without the added frustration of Working Design's balancing. It's an extremely cute, short, and satisfying game. Late in the year, Sony and Polyphony Digital released a free game called My First Gran Turismo. This is basically an extended demo of Gran Turismo 7, featuring 18 different cars, 3 existing tracks, and a series of license tests, time trials, and races to partake in. I've been playing Gran Turismo 7 since it came out. In fact, it's my second most played game on the PlayStation 5, just about to overtake Gran Turismo Sport as of this writing. So I didn't really see the need to download and play this demo at first, but I have to admit I was a bit curious about its structure. And when I heard that you can actually unlock those 18 cars and add them to your garage in just a bit over an hour, I figured why not? I think My First Gran Turismo does a fantastic job of showing players exactly what they can expect from Gran Turismo 7, for better or worse. Much like the main game, it feels like the content you really want to reach here is locked behind a bit of busy work. But when you do manage to open everything up, there's some fun to be had here. Speaking as a GT7 fan, I also think it's neat to see that Polyphony made a small adjustment to the races here. Now, when you cross the finish line at the end of a race, you'll notice your crew members hanging off the fence in celebration. It ultimately has no real effect on the gameplay or quality, but it's kinda cool nonetheless. The 18 unlockable cars are nothing special. In fact, if you've played GT7 for any length of time, chances are you already own them. Still, if I was just starting out on my Gran Turismo 7 journey, it would be nice to have this little pack of vehicles in my garage to begin my campaign. And even as a GT7 vet, it was cool to be able to sell these cars and convert my playtime into some in-game credits. After playing through Batman on the Game Boy earlier in the year, I had no intention of jumping back into the NES game. However, in mid-December, an old friend of mine passed away. When we were kids, we used to play a lot of video games together, and my memory of playing through Batman NES in particular is entirely linked to hanging out with him. So I decided to stream the game on my channel the week he passed away, and while it was only meant to be a casual stream, I ended up finishing the game that night. I think it was the first time I'd done so since my friend and I played through it originally when we were both 14. Batman NES is truly a classic. Incredible graphics, great controls, my favorite wall jump in a video game ever, and some amazing tunes. This game came out right in Sunsoft's sweet spot. They were just killing it at the tail end of the 80s and early 90s. I'm so happy I managed to get through the whole game that night in honor of my friend. We hadn't been close for probably 30 years, but his friendship was a major part of my childhood, and so many of my favorite memories are centered around our shared love of video games. And that does it for my first attempt at a video like this. I hope you enjoyed it, and please look forward to another one next January. Thanks so much to all my patrons for their continued support, and I hope everyone has a wonderful 2025.